citizens speak out. In countries across the world, people are calling for greater government fairness in the treatment of individuals and their families, including better job opportunities as well as permitting a voice in the laws that rule their country. Among these nations are Bahrain, China, Libya, Mauritania, Mexico, Palestine, Syria, Tibet, and Yemen.
Thousands of Mexican citizens in 20 cities across the country marched on Wednesday, April 6th, calling for an end to drug-related violence, which has killed 35,000 people since 2006. According to a report by Radio Free Asia, Chinese authorities halted a protest by Tibetans calling for equitable settlements in the face of China's plans to seize their land for redevelopment following a devastating earthquake. Witnesses said that many of the protesters were injured while others were detained, with representatives vowing to continue with peaceful demonstrations.
Following the arrest of internationally known and outspoken Chinese artist Ai Weiwei last Sunday, Hong Kong activists joined others in the international community in protesting his detainment and urging his release, including the United States, Germany, United Kingdom, and other European Union member states. Mr. Ai, also son of one of China's most famous modern poets, Ai King, is among dozens who have been arrested by the government since February. A European delegation to China expressed concern about the increasing number of human rights activists and lawyers being arbitrarily detained. Meanwhile, Chinese writer Mr. Zhao Lianhai, who was imprisoned for a month in 2010 following his campaign against a tainted milk scandal that sickened his own and 300,000 other children, was detained again briefly on Wednesday after he asked the government to release Mr. Ai Weiwei. In response to the recent events, Hong Kong Legislative Council member Emily Lau stated, "It is time that the Chinese government listens to people like Mr. Ai Weiwei or Mr. Zhao Lianhai, saying you have to respect the rights of your own people. Let them speak out."
In Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, forces loyal to incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo have shown no signs of surrender as the president remains in his surrounded residence in Abidjan, despite a last warning on Thursday from the United Nations to step aside in recognition of elected President Alassane Ouattara. Meanwhile, an estimated 20 foreign journalists and diplomats from Japan, Israel, and India asked the US and UN for aid in fleeing from a besieged area in Abidjan. Upon receiving word that the Japanese diplomats' lives were at risk after government-led forces invaded their building, French troops acting in cooperation with the United Nations on Thursday were able to airlift them to safety.
A group of 40 prominent Israelis released a draft Israeli peace plan in an attempt to encourage the Israeli government to make peace with Palestine, while the European Union and the US both spoke out against Israel's decision to build more Jewish settlements in Palestinian territories, with the UN declaring them to be illegal. On Wednesday, in the Palestinian West Bank town of Awarta, Israeli officials arrested and later released over 100 women during an overnight house-to-house search for suspects in the death of a family who had been living in a nearby Jewish settlement that was built on Palestinian land. In Palestinian Gaza, after a rocket fired from the area landed on an Israeli school bus, injuring at least 2 people, 1 critically, airstrikes and artillery fire from Israel resulted in the death of 5 and wounding of more than 30 Palestinian people.
With scores of Bahraini activists, including 14 women, having been arrested since protests began in February, many are now also missing. Meanwhile, a day after citizens held a funeral procession for a man found dead in Sar, Press TV reports that female protester Khadija al-Abdullahi was killed on Thursday in the village of Sanabis. Around 200 members of Iran's parliament criticized Saudi Arabia for sending troops to Bahrain to repress peaceful protests, with attacks that have included the destruction of a mosque.
In Yemen, following dozens of fatalities during protests this past week, tens of thousands still turned out on Wednesday in Taiz, with large groups each walking several miles from different parts of the city to converge in a unified call for the resignation of President Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Meanwhile, President Saleh has reiterated calls for protesters' representatives to join him in mediated talks with the Gulf Cooperation Council after having ignored their proposal that he step down in peaceful transition of power. Amnesty International also released a report urging for an international investigation of the deaths of 94 protesters, also recommending against any deals that would grant President Saleh and close relatives immunity in exchange for his resignation.
With most protests in Syria occurring after Friday prayers, the government has attempted to address some of the religious leaders' concerns by closing the country's only gambling casino and relaxing restrictions on women wearing headscarves as part of their religious observation. However, despite the president's offer on Thursday of another concession to protesters by granting citizenship to thousands of Kurdish residents, citizens, such changes were considered superficial by many, according to leading human rights activist and lawyer Haitham Al-Maleh, who also said that protests would continue until real changes were made. US-based National Public Radio meanwhile reported that people from the city of Daraa had begun fleeing to Jordan to escape the conflict in their homeland.
Former U.S. Congressman Kurt Weldon is visiting Tripoli at the invitation of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who he met in 2004, with a ceasefire proposal. Colonel Gaddafi has also written a letter to U.S. President Barack Obama asking for a ceasefire.
In response to the Libyan government's recent accusation that British planes attacked the country's oil fields and infrastructure, Commander Lieutenant Charles Bouchard of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, said that their forces were never in the area, as this was not a region where civilian populations were at risk.
Meanwhile, after pro-democracy leaders criticized NATO for not doing enough to protect the citizens of Misurata, where government forces continue heavy attacks on civilians, NATO pledged that protecting the people is now its top priority. However, French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé raised concerns about the difficulty in achieving this because of government troops' use of innocent civilians as human shields.
As much of the population is still trapped and unable to receive basic supplies such as water, food, and medicines, the confirmed dead from attacks by Libyan government forces has reached 247, with locals saying the actual number is much higher because of not being able to report on the people dying in homes throughout the city. On Thursday, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called for a ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid into Misurata, as he also expressed concern for other municipalities where civilian populations have been under military attack by government forces, including Brega and Zintan.
Tragically, on Wednesday, an overladen boat carrying African migrants leaving Libya toward Europe capsized off the southern Italian island of Lampedusa. Italian officials stated that 51 people were rescued, but up to 250 remain missing. On Thursday, Italian Immigration Minister Roberto Maroni announced that Italy will give temporary humanitarian visas to many of the tens of thousands of Tunisian and other North African refugees who have arrived since the beginning of the year, allowing them to fulfill their wish to join family or friends in European Schengen zone countries.
As we mourn the loss of cherished lives, we pray for the halting of conflict in all nations, as people in every spectrum of society treat each other with mutual respect, so that all may live in shared freedom, dignity, and peace.
In sorrowful response to these unfortunate world events, Supreme Master Qinghai lovingly reminds, "If the road is wrong, the more we walk on it, the more we go wrong. Any leaders who committed harm to others should stop at once, sincerely repent to God, and act to redeem their mistaken deeds. Then they will be pardoned, even if humans can't forgive. Heaven will."